Good morning and welcome to Sunday School at Second Baptist. We're going to finish up today in the book of Ecclesiastes. We just did kind of the first half of the book last week, and this week we're going to conclude. And as in case you missed last week, I'll mention again that the reason we're on Ecclesiastes, if you happen to be looking at the student book, is because these 2 weeks of our student book, we're covering the Song of Solomon, and it's good information in the student book, but it wasn't something that I felt comfortable teaching that in the way that they had presented it, and so I just went, on my own tangent, except that I felt the Lord was leading me to go ahead and go into Ecclesiastes. And as it turns out, just to review briefly, Ecclesiastes is also written by Solomon, and we see that this is sort of a conclusion of his life in the things that he has observed in all his wisdom and learned, and tried to explore everything that he could to figure out what was important in life, what was the meaning of life, and all of those things. And so Ecclesiastes throughout is sort of that conclusion. He draws some conclusions. And so we're going to start today in the sort of the second half of chapter 5 of Ecclesiastes. And in the first half of chapter 5, he had given what I was calling last week a nugget, which was a helpful, useful bit of information, kind of that you could make a daily devotion or something like that out of that one thing. And he was talking about guarding your steps when you come close to God, and being in awe of God, or being, fearing God. Don't be hasty in the things you ask of God, and like that. And so after having talked about your attitude towards God, now he's going to go back and again bring out some of the follies. Like we had at the beginning of the lesson last week, we talked about the follies. He had the folly of riches and the folly of possessions, and the folly of wisdom, and the folly of everything, and how all the meaning of all of those things was just useless in the end. And so he goes back again today in the second half of chapter 5, and he begins to talk about the folly of riches again, and how a person works and labors, and at the end of their life they still die, and then he talks about the futility of life along with that, and how men labor under this hot sun and all of that. Then in chapter 7, and I guess it's 6 and 7, but particularly in 7, there's a long sort of almost sounds like an excerpt from the Proverbs in a way, because it goes back to that style of the Proverbs where it's almost like each verse is a little proverb. And so that first half of chapter 7 is like that. And good information, to read through. When you get down to verse 15, I'll read that verse. So this is chapter 7 and verse 15. He says, "I have seen everything during my lifetime of futility. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his wickedness." And so what again in other places right through this section, he's talking about how it just doesn't make sense. I mean, there's no point to it. It's futile. It's futile. I guess even he's even maybe saying that it seems futile that a man should live righteously, and then he dies, and then the wicked man lives wickedly, and he lives a long life. And we see that, where you just wonder, why is that? That it works out that way. But God has, like we talked about last week, God has the big picture in mind, and He knows why these things happen the way they do. And then Solomon goes back in chapters 8 and 9, and he begins to advise again and give advice on life. And some of that is important teaching, about things in the way to live, to obey the law, to that men are in the hand of God. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your heart, and some of those things. And then in chapter 10, he returns back once again to the foolish man, and he talks some more about the foolish man and the things that the foolish man does. And so we get down to chapter 11, and that's where I want to focus now, from chapter 11 on to the end of this book. And when we start chapter 11, I think what I'll do is I'll go ahead and read the first 2 verses, and then we'll talk about those, and then we'll go on to the next few. So chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. Cast your bread on the surface of the waters, for you will find it after many days. Divide your portion to 7 or even to 8, for you do not know what misfortune may occur on the earth. And this is a famous verse that I've heard preached a number of times, where pastors talk about the gospel and casting your bread upon the water. There's another verse, I don't think it's this one, because it's quoted differently, unless that's just the King James Version, where it says, cast your bread on the waters and it will return to you, it will not return to you void. So this says you will find it after many days. And I started thinking about this verse, and I thought, what does this really mean? I mean, casting bread on the water doesn't really make sense. You could try to justify that and figure out some way that that's going to float or whatever. And actually, I've heard that in a sermon before. That, it was like this, because the bread would float. I don't know. Bible interpretation can be different. And I looked at 6 or 7 commentaries on these particular verses as I was studying for this lesson, and they were different. There were different interpretations of what this means. So you may want to Google it yourself and go on to some website like Bible Hub, HUB, and that is a nice website because it gives lots of the different versions of the Bible, and you can compare those, and it also has the commentaries there from a lot of the famous commentaries, and you can read there, for a particular verse if you don't understand what it means. It's kind of a nice reference, and it's on, it's on the internet, so it's free if you have internet access. Anyway, back to the verse then. Casting your bread on the waters. If you think of you were going to cast this bread on the water and then somehow it's going to come back to you. After reading all the commentaries and just kind of thinking it through a lot, I came up with the idea from them that it has to do with going ahead and doing a thing of maybe service to others, even though it may be a thankless task that you don't get any reward for doing it, and no immediate reward for doing it. You don't seem to reap any benefit for having done it. So it's a thankless task, and in some ways it may feel like you are wasting resources in some way to do this thing. So it's like you're casting that out there, maybe we'll say in faith, and having no expectation of reaping anything from it. But then it says, you will find it after many days. And so I think this is an encouragement to us that if we will do these things thanklessly, without expectations of reaping some reward, a reward will come. God will send our reward in a way that we might not expect it. And it may be a long or short time coming that we would receive that reward. And honestly, the things we do that God leads us to do, we should do those with no expectations. We don't do something, when God leads us to do something, we don't do it because we think it's going to make us wealthy or famous, or that we're going to get the same thing back that we did for another person, or whatever. That's really not that should not be our motivation for doing a thing that we do that God leads us to do. So then it talks about dividing your portion to 7 or even 8, because you do not know what misfortune may occur on the earth. And on that part of it, I feel like you could even more make the application of sharing the gospel with people, and you could apply it to that situation. You may also apply it to other benevolent things that you might do, or whatever. But let's compare it for a moment to sharing the gospel, or apply it to sharing the gospel. And in that way, the thing that you have, it is saying divide it and send it out in many directions, because you don't know what misfortune may occur on the earth. And that is an important principle that we taught in church planting and sharing the gospel in Africa, is that you need to sow the seed broadly. If you are only sowing your seed in one place, in this one spot, and you just go back every time and you just witness to this person over and over and over again, then yes, they've heard the gospel, and yes, you care about that person. But in order for the gospel to spread, it must spread broadly. And to do that, then you need to share broadly, just like you scatter seed, and you don't know which one is going to grow. And so you share with as many people as you can, because you know that someone among them is going to get it. It's going to take root in that person's heart. God is going to use it, and they're going to begin to follow Him. They're going to begin to understand. And so that's why we taught, and we still teach, sowing the seed broadly. And I think this can easily be applied in that same way, that you divide your portion and you send it out in many ways, and then some of that is going to reap a reward or have a benefit or make a difference in some way. And that means that some of it won't make a difference. And that you have to be willing to accept that some of your efforts to share the gospel are not going to have any impact at all. And you have to be willing to work with that in mind, knowing that I'm going to share and share and share and share and share, and it may feel like some days like nobody cares what you said. But if you will keep on sharing, then it will take root in some places, in some people's heart. It might be the one you least expect. That verse just popped into my mind, that where it says, I should have stopped talking right when the verse popped into my mind. Now it's going right back out. I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, I had a verse along with this whole section here too, which is a similar sort of concept from Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 44, where Jesus said, love your enemies. And he talked about loving your enemies in that Sermon on the Mount there in Matthew chapter 5. And I think the concept is similar in that when you love your friends, you get a reward from that. They love you back and you just have a great time. But if you love your enemies, you show love to your enemies, you may not get any response. You may even get a negative response for having done that. But that is what Jesus told us to do, is to love our enemies. And in these days, I think that is super important, that we remember the words of Jesus when he said, love your enemies. And we share the seed broadly as we can. Now let's go on to the next verses, and we're going to read. We're still going to be in chapter 11. We're going to read verses 4 to 6, and this little part right here is one of my most favorite verses in the Bible, I think. Verse 4 through 6 of chapter 11. He who watches the wind will not sow, and he who looks at the clouds will not reap. Just as you do not know the path of the wind and how bones are formed in the womb of the pregnant woman, so you do not know the activity of God who makes all things. Sow your seed in the morning, and do not be idle in the evening, for you do not know whether morning or evening sowing will succeed, or whether both of them alike will be good. I love these verses because they were an inspiration to us as we were missionaries in Africa. And they inspired us to keep on going in spite of difficult seed sowing at times. Because it says, if you watch the wind, you're not going to plant, or you're not going to sow your seed. And of course, that obviously means that, you look out your door and you think, oh, it's windy. I don't think this is a good day to plant seed. We'll wait till tomorrow and see, if it's better. Tomorrow, maybe it's rainy, and let's don't plant the seed today because it's raining too hard. We'll wait for the next day. And the next day, oh, it's too hot. The ground is dry. This is not a good day for doing it. And then you're back to windy again. And so the meaning of it, is very clear. That if you look at the wind, you won't go out and sow your seed. And he who looks at the clouds will not reap. Again, the same idea. That if you look out and you say, it's a rainy day, I'm not going to go out into the harvest field and try to share the gospel and see if someone will come to Christ today. It's rainy, it's messy weather, it's cold, we need to stay at home, it's COVID, it's whatever, And so you don't. And so this is just an inspiration to us to say that we don't look at those things to guide us. If God has called us to do something, and I have two applications for this little section here. And the first one is this. If God calls you to do something, God has shown you through His Holy Spirit that this is the thing that you should work on and you should do. Then don't look at the wind or the rain. Just get moving and start doing it. Because God, we don't know, this second part of what we read there says, you do not know the activity of God who makes all things. And so, if God has led you to do a thing, whatever activity that is, and you're sure that it was God leading you and not you just thinking it up, then He is at work in that. And as you join hands and get into that work, you're going to be blessed, the most blessed that you could be, because you have joined in the activity of God. And this part of that, you can, if you've ever studied Master Life or Experiencing God, you recognize that sort of an idea or that sort of a thought. Find out what God is doing and join Him in it. That's one of the things that is in the study called Experiencing God. So, the second application for this little section of Scripture here is the application of sharing the gospel. And again, I said that at the beginning of it, kind of, that, if you look at the clouds or you look at the rain, you're not going to go out and you're not going to share the gospel. So I'm not going to limit this application to only sharing the gospel, though. I am expanding it to say any endeavor that God is leading you to do. Do it. Just do it. Against all odds, I guess you might say. And then from there, let's go forward just a little bit, because it starts talking about it talks about sow your seed in the morning and don't be idle in the evening, because you don't know whether morning or evening sowing will succeed or whether both of them alike will be good. Again, you could talk about the stages of life that you got when you're young and vigorous. You work hard to sow your seed and to sow the seed of the gospel. But it says don't be idle in the evening. When you get old, don't stop, because you really don't know which is going to be the more successful. Is it going to be your youthful enthusiasm that someone sees and is attracted to the gospel because of that? Or is it going to be your wisdom of life that you have when you're older, so that someone will listen to you and respect your opinion about the gospel? Very important for us throughout our lives, as long as God leaves us here, to be working in sharing the gospel with other people. And then at in chapter 12, let's conclude now. Chapter 12, verses 1 to 4, I'm going to read those. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, when you will say, I have no delight in them. Before the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are darkened, and clouds return after the rain. In the day that the watchmen of the house tremble, and mighty men stoop, The grinding ones stand idle because they are few, and those who look through windows grow dim. And the doors on the street are shut as the sound of the grinding mill is low, and one will arise at the sound of the bird, and all the daughters of song will sing softly. So I like this. It's very poetic, and Solomon wrote it in that way. He's referring to an older person whose teeth don't grind the food anymore, and whose eyes are maybe cloudy, that they don't see well, they don't hear well. And so it says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the years become more difficult. And that, we hear that sermon preached pretty often, to the young people, to be sure that you work hard for God when you have the energy and strength and enthusiasm that God has given you as a young person, that you don't waste it on the follies of life, but that you work hard for God when you're young, because when you get older it's more difficult, and we know that that's true. And then at the very conclusion of Ecclesiastes, I'm going to read verses 13 and 14. The conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep His commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. Now, this, I guess you could say, is the meaning of life, the purpose of life, the summary of all the things that Solomon talked about. In conclusion, fear God and keep His commandments. Those are the things that we really need to do, every person. We are in awe of God, and we do what He said. And if we do those things, then everything else in life is going to fall into place in the way that it should. And it says, God will bring every act to judgment, and everything that is hidden, whether it is good or evil. And so all of these other things that Solomon mentioned, how a righteous man lives a short life and this wicked man just seems to live on, or how you work so hard your whole life and you toil, and then you have to give it to somebody who doesn't even appreciate it when they get it. All of those things that he's mentioned through the book, and even through Proverbs, is summarized in the fact that God will bring everything to judgment one day. And He will, the things that are hidden are going to be revealed, whether it's good or it's evil. And those things will be rewarded. And we know that that's true, and it's mentioned, in a number of other places in the Bible, and especially in the book of the Revelation, where it talks about the rewards and things like that. And that is really the meaning of life, isn't it? And so I thank you for studying through the Proverbs with me, and then Ecclesiastes, as we have done. And I pray that in conclusion, as we've concluded this, that you will be inspired to cast your bread on the waters more and more, and to sow broadly, sow the seed broadly, so that you can have the joy of seeing some of that, take root and grow in a person's life. I thank you very much. And now next Sunday, we will begin the study of Isaiah, and the student book is available at the church. So pick one up if you come to the church, or you could come by the church office during the week and get one. And we'll begin to study through the book of Isaiah. I look forward to seeing you then.